Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone mistakes for the weakest. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Lexington Ballroom cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests dressed in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, their laughter floating above the soft notes of a string quartet as waiters carried trays of champagne through the crowd. Tonight was Victoria Hale's wedding, the kind of Manhattan celebration people talked about for months, a $10 million event filled with CEOs, investors, and socialites who came not only to celebrate love but to witness the triumph Victoria wanted the world to see. She stood near the altar in a flawless white gown that shimmered under the lights, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, accepting compliments, but every few seconds her eyes drifted toward the tall double doors at the back of the ballroom. She was waiting for someone. Whispers moved through the room when the doors finally opened and a tall man stepped inside, calm, composed, unmistakably confident. Ethan Caldwell had arrived. The billionaire carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone used to being watched, his black suit perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable as the music softened and conversations faded. Some guests leaned closer to one another, murmuring about the famous divorce that had once dominated financial headlines, about how Victoria had moved on, about how Ethan had supposedly lost everything that mattered. Victoria's smile sharpened slightly as she saw him, as if this moment had been part of her plan all along. But the whispers changed the moment people noticed he wasn't alone. Walking beside Ethan was a woman who looked completely out of place in the ballroom's golden glow. Her coat was worn and slightly oversized, the kind someone might buy at a thrift store for $20, her shoes scuffed from miles of walking across city sidewalks, her hair loosely tied back as if elegance had never been the point. Conversation stopped entirely now, replaced with confused glances and quiet laughter as several guests assumed it had to be some kind of strange joke. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her voice carrying just enough sweetness to reach nearby tables when she spoke. "Ethan," she said with a thin smile, "I didn't realize tonight included charity work." A few guests chuckled, lifting champagne glasses as if the comment had been part of the evening's entertainment. But the woman beside Ethan didn't react the way anyone expected. She didn't shrink, didn't apologize, didn't even seem uncomfortable under the weight of hundreds of curious stares. Instead, she simply looked around the ballroom slowly, her calm gray eyes studying the chandeliers, the marble floors, the elegant guests, as though she had seen rooms like this before and none of it impressed her. Ethan said nothing, only giving the faintest nod toward the seats as if this entrance had been perfectly ordinary. Yet across the room, Victoria's fiancé, standing near the altar and greeting investors, suddenly froze the moment his eyes landed on the woman. The color drained from his face so quickly that the best man leaned toward him in confusion, because while everyone else saw a homeless woman who didn't belong at a $10 million wedding, the groom was staring at someone he recognized immediately, someone he clearly never expected to see again. And as the quiet woman slowly turned her gaze toward him from across the ballroom, the calm expression on her face made one thing unmistakably clear. She hadn't come here by accident. The silence in the ballroom lingered longer than anyone expected, as if the entire room had suddenly forgotten how conversations normally worked. Waiters who had been moving gracefully between tables slowed their steps. A violinist from the quartet glanced toward the entrance before quietly lowering his bow. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the strange pair who had just entered together. Ethan Caldwell did not appear concerned by the attention. He moved forward at an unhurried pace, guiding the woman beside him through the wide marble aisle between tables decorated with white roses and crystal centerpieces. Each step of her worn shoes against the polished floor sounded louder than it should have, not because of the noise, but because every person in the room was watching. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Around them were tailored suits worth thousands of dollars, dresses that had likely been flown in from Paris, watches that cost more than most cars. And beside Ethan walked a woman whose coat looked as if it had seen years of winter streets and subway platforms. Yet her posture was steady. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her eyes did not dart nervously the way most people would when surrounded by strangers judging them. Instead, she observed everything with quiet attention, as if the ballroom were simply another room she had stepped into on an ordinary evening. Victoria Hale watched their approach with a composed smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She held a champagne glass lightly between her fingers while standing beside a group of guests who had been congratulating her moments earlier. When Ethan came within a few feet, The quiet tension finally broke into soft laughter among the surrounding tables. A woman in a silver gown leaned toward her friend and whispered loudly enough to be heard, wondering if Ethan had mistaken the wedding for a charity gala. Another guest murmured that perhaps the billionaire had lost a bet. Victoria tilted her head, studying the woman beside Ethan more carefully now. The coat was faded but clean. The hair was loosely tied but not neglected. The face carried no embarrassment, no pleading expression, no attempt to blend into the background. It was that calm that bothered Victoria the most. Most people who did not belong in a place like this tried very hard to disappear. This woman did not try at all. Victoria took a small step forward, her voice smooth and pleasant in the way practiced hosts used when they wanted to sound polite while delivering something far less friendly. She asked Ethan if he had decided to surprise everyone with an unusual guest. Ethan's response was simple. He said the woman's name was Clara. Nothing more. No explanation followed. The guests exchanged puzzled glances. A few people expected Clara to speak or thank someone or offer an apology for the awkward entrance, but she remained silent. Her attention had shifted across the ballroom toward the raised platform where the groom stood greeting another group of investors. The moment her eyes settled on him, something subtle changed in the air. The groom had been smiling only seconds earlier while shaking hands with a venture capitalist from Chicago, but now his handshake slowed. His expression stiffened in a way that almost nobody noticed at first. His gaze drifted past the investor's shoulder, landing on the woman standing beside Ethan Caldwell. For a brief second he looked as if he had misidentified someone in the crowd. Then the recognition settled in fully. His smile faded. The investor continued speaking, unaware that the groom was no longer listening. From across the ballroom Clara watched him quietly, her face still calm, but there was something unmistakable in her eyes now. Not anger, not fear, but the quiet certainty of someone who had been waiting a very long time to stand in exactly this place at exactly this moment. Around them the wedding slowly returned to its cheerful rhythm. Music resumed. Glasses clinked again. Guests whispered speculation about Ethan's strange companion. But near the altar the groom could not seem to look away, because while every other person in the ballroom believed they were watching a homeless woman who had wandered into the wrong celebration, he knew something none of them did, and the realization was settling heavily in his mind that the one person he had hoped never to see again had just walked into the most public moment of his life. The music resumed in the ballroom, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that only a few people seemed to notice. Laughter sounded slightly forced now, conversations carried an edge of curiosity, and more than one guest glanced toward Ethan Caldwell and the quiet woman standing beside him. They had taken seats near the middle of the room, not hidden in the back, not placed among the most prestigious tables near the stage, but somewhere directly between both worlds, as if Ethan had chosen the position carefully. Clara sat with her hands folded loosely in front of her, her worn coat resting over the back of the chair. From a distance she still looked like someone who did not belong among the polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Yet the longer she remained seated there, the harder it became to ignore the way she carried herself. She did not fidget. She did not avoid eye contact. When a waiter approached with a tray of champagne glasses, she politely declined with a small shake of her head, thanking him with a calm voice that sounded educated and steady. The waiter blinked slightly, perhaps surprised by her tone, before continuing on. At a nearby table 2 investors from Boston whispered to each other that Ethan Caldwell must have brought the woman as some sort of social experiment. Another guest suggested that perhaps she had once worked for him and fallen on difficult times. None of their theories were correct. Across the ballroom Victoria Hale continued greeting guests, smiling for photographs and accepting congratulations with effortless charm, but every few seconds her attention drifted back toward Ethan and Clara. She could feel the quiet ripple of gossip spreading across the room, and she refused to allow her wedding day to become a spectacle about her former husband. With graceful steps she approached their table again, her expression still perfectly composed. She asked Ethan if he was enjoying the evening, and whether his guest required anything more comfortable than the chair she had been given. The tone of the question sounded polite to anyone who did not listen carefully, but the implication was clear. Several nearby guests leaned slightly closer, curious to hear the exchange. Ethan responded calmly that Clara was perfectly comfortable. His voice held the same quiet confidence he used in boardrooms when discussing deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Clara simply watched the interaction without speaking. Then something unexpected happened. One of the older guests at the neighboring table, a retired professor from Columbia University who had spent decades studying global finance, glanced toward Clara out of casual curiosity. First he looked away. Then he looked back again more carefully. His brows slowly tightened as if a memory had just begun forming at the edge of his mind. He studied her face for several seconds longer before leaning forward slightly in his chair. The professor whispered to the man beside him that the woman looked strangely familiar. The other man shrugged, assuming it was impossible for someone who appeared homeless to be recognized among Manhattan academics. Meanwhile, near the altar, the groom had grown noticeably distracted. He had attempted to return to polite conversation with his guests, but his gaze kept drifting across the ballroom. Every time his eyes found Clara sitting calmly beside Ethan, a subtle tension appeared in his expression. It was the look of someone remembering a chapter of his past that he believed had been closed forever. The orchestra began transitioning into the soft music that signaled the ceremony would soon begin. Guests started taking their seats while photographers adjusted their cameras near the front of the room. Clara watched the movement quietly. Her eyes passed once more across the guests, the stage, the elegant decorations, and finally settled again on the groom. This time she allowed the faintest smile to touch the corner of her lips, not a smile of amusement, not a smile of kindness, but the calm expression of someone who had arrived exactly where she intended to be. The guests gradually settled into their seats as the music softened again. But the quiet tension surrounding Ethan Caldwell and the mysterious woman beside him continued to ripple through the ballroom like a current beneath still water. Clara remained seated calmly while the room prepared for the ceremony. From where she sat she could see the wide aisle leading to the stage, lined with white roses and soft candlelight. The entire scene looked like something from a luxury magazine, the kind of wedding people spent years planning and millions of dollars arranging. Yet Clara's attention was not on the decorations or the guests admiring the elegant setting. Her gaze drifted slowly across the faces in the room, as if she were searching for something specific among them. Across the ballroom, the groom stood beside his best man while a wedding coordinator adjusted the final details near the altar. He tried to appear composed, but every few seconds his eyes returned to Clara. The tension in his expression had become impossible for him to hide completely. The best man leaned closer and asked quietly if everything was all right. The groom forced a brief smile and nodded, though the answer was clearly not convincing. Meanwhile, the retired professor who had been watching Clara earlier continued studying her carefully. His curiosity had turned into something closer to disbelief. He leaned forward again and whispered that he was certain he had seen her somewhere before, perhaps in an academic conference or in a financial journal years ago. His companion laughed softly and reminded him that the woman looked like she had spent more time on city sidewalks than university lecture halls. But the professor did not laugh. His memory was stirring more clearly now. Something about the woman's posture, the calm intelligence in her eyes, even the way she observed the room reminded him of someone whose name had once been mentioned frequently in discussions about global markets. At Ethan's table, the silence between him and Clara felt deliberate rather than awkward. He did not attempt to explain her presence to the curious guests nearby. Instead, he simply watched the ballroom with the quiet patience of someone waiting for a moment that had not yet arrived. Finally, he spoke softly to Clara, asking if she was certain she wanted to remain once the ceremony began. His voice carried genuine concern rather than hesitation. Clara turned her head slightly toward him, her expression composed. She answered that she had not come all this way simply to leave before the most important part. Ethan studied her for a moment longer before nodding slowly, as if confirming something he had suspected from the beginning. A few tables away, Victoria noticed the exchange and felt a flicker of irritation beneath her polished smile. This evening had been carefully orchestrated to celebrate her future, and to show everyone that she had moved beyond the past. Yet somehow Ethan's quiet arrival with that strange woman had shifted the attention of the room in ways she did not appreciate. She turned toward the wedding coordinator and signaled that the ceremony should begin immediately. The orchestra responded with a graceful transition into the processional music. Guests straightened in their chairs and photographers lifted their cameras. The groom stepped into position beside the officiant, though the tightness in his expression had not disappeared. As the first bridesmaids began walking down the aisle, Clara's gaze remained fixed on the stage. The faint smile that had appeared earlier returned again, subtle and almost unreadable. For everyone else in the ballroom, the ceremony represented the start of a celebration. For Clara, it felt like the final moment before a long-delayed truth stepped into the light. The music guiding the wedding procession flowed gently through the ballroom as the bridesmaids continued walking down the long aisle between rows of elegant chairs, their satin dresses catching the soft glow of candlelight. Guests watched with warm smiles, lifting phones and cameras to capture the moment. Yet beneath the polished celebration, a quiet tension still lingered in the room, like a whisper no one wanted to acknowledge. Clara remained seated beside Ethan Caldwell, her attention fixed calmly on the stage. From a distance she appeared no different than before, the same worn coat resting across the back of her chair, the same simple shoes against the polished marble floor, but something in her expression had shifted. It was subtle, almost impossible for most people to notice, yet the quiet certainty in her eyes suggested that every step of the ceremony unfolding before her was exactly what she had been waiting for. Ethan glanced toward her briefly, studying the calm composure on her face. He had met Clara only days earlier, yet there was something about her presence that had convinced him to trust his instincts in a way he rarely did. Most people in his world measured trust through contracts and negotiations. Clara had earned his attention simply by speaking with a clarity that felt impossible to ignore. Across the ballroom, the groom stood beside the officiant, trying to maintain the confident posture expected from a man about to be married in front of hundreds of influential guests. However, every few seconds his gaze drifted back toward Clara's table. Each time he looked at her, the tightness in his jaw returned. The best man leaned toward him again, quietly asking if something was wrong. The groom forced another brief smile and assured him everything was fine, though his voice carried a slight strain that did not escape the notice of the person standing closest to him. The professor seated near Ethan had now stopped pretending his curiosity was casual. He leaned forward again, adjusting his glasses as he studied Clara's profile more carefully. The faint lines of memory in his mind were becoming sharper. Years ago there had been articles in financial journals about a brilliant analyst who had predicted several market shifts with remarkable accuracy. Conferences had invited her to speak. Universities had quoted her research. The professor could almost remember the name attached to those articles, but the thought slipped away each time he tried to grasp it completely. At the front of the ballroom, the music shifted again as Victoria finally appeared at the entrance to the aisle, her white gown flowing behind her like a wave of silk. Guests turned in admiration as she began her walk toward the altar, her father guiding her forward step by step. Cameras flashed softly around the room while the orchestra continued its elegant melody. Victoria's smile was radiant as she moved closer to the stage, yet even she could not stop her eyes from briefly drifting toward Ethan and Clara as she passed their table. For a moment the two women looked directly at one another. Victoria expected to see embarrassment or discomfort in the stranger's face. Instead she found calm observation, as if Clara were simply witnessing the final moments of a story she already understood. The groom watched Victoria approach, but his attention flickered again toward Clara just before the bride reached his side. The officiant welcomed everyone and began speaking about commitment and new beginnings while the guests listened respectfully. Yet for Clara the words carried little meaning. Her gaze remained steady on the groom. The faint smile returned to her lips, not with excitement, not with anger, but with the quiet patience of someone who knew that the most important moment of the evening had not arrived yet. And when it did, the entire room would finally understand why she had chosen to walk through those ballroom doors beside Ethan Caldwell. The officiant's calm voice carried gently through the ballroom as he spoke about commitment, trust, and the promise of building a future together. But the words seemed to float above the guests rather than truly reach them because the attention of the room had quietly shifted elsewhere. Most eyes remained on the elegant couple standing beneath the arch of white roses at the altar, yet a growing number of glances continued drifting toward the middle tables where Ethan Caldwell sat beside the woman everyone still believed to be a homeless stranger. Clara listened to the ceremony with the same steady composure she had shown since the moment she entered the ballroom. Her posture was relaxed, her hands folded loosely in front of her, and her gaze remained fixed on the stage as though every detail unfolding there carried a meaning invisible to everyone else. The groom attempted to maintain the confident smile expected of him, but the effort was becoming harder with each passing minute. The longer the ceremony continued, the more his attention betrayed him. Every time he tried to focus on the officiant's words, his eyes pulled back toward Clara as if some silent force refused to let him ignore her presence. Victoria noticed the tension as well. She kept her radiant smile for the guests and cameras, yet she could sense that something was wrong. The groom's responses to the officiant had become slightly delayed, his voice less certain than before. When she followed his gaze across the ballroom, she once again found Clara sitting calmly beside Ethan. A brief shadow crossed Victoria's expression before she forced herself to look forward again. Near Ethan's table, the retired professor could no longer contain his curiosity. The pieces of memory in his mind had almost connected. He leaned closer toward Clara as the ceremony paused briefly for the exchange of readings. His voice was quiet and respectful when he finally spoke. He asked if they had met before at a financial conference many years ago in Boston. Clara turned her head slowly toward him. For a moment the professor felt certain he would receive a polite denial. Instead Clara studied him with thoughtful recognition and offered a faint nod, acknowledging that his memory was stronger than most. The professor's eyes widened slightly behind his glasses. The name that had been hovering in his mind suddenly felt close enough to grasp, yet he hesitated to speak it aloud. Ethan observed the exchange silently, noticing the way the professor's confusion slowly turned into realization. On the stage, the officiant invited the couple to begin sharing their vows. The groom cleared his throat and began speaking about love, partnership, and the excitement of the life he and Victoria would build together. His voice carried through the microphones placed near the altar, yet there was a strain beneath his words that a few guests quietly noticed. Clara listened carefully, her expression calm but focused. When the groom finished his vow, the officiant turned toward Victoria, inviting her to speak next. She began beautifully, her voice confident and warm, describing the happiness she believed awaited them both. The room listened with polite admiration. But just as Victoria reached the final sentence of her vow, something unexpected happened. Clara slowly rose from her chair. The movement was small, yet it immediately caught the attention of several nearby guests. Chairs shifted quietly as people turned their heads. Ethan remained seated, watching Clara with a calm expression that suggested he had been expecting this moment. Clara looked toward the stage, toward the groom whose face had suddenly gone pale with recognition. Then, with the same quiet composure she had carried since entering the ballroom, she took a single step forward into the aisle as if the ceremony had reached the exact point where her presence could no longer remain silent. The moment Clara stepped into the aisle, the quiet murmur that had returned to the ballroom vanished again, as if the entire room had suddenly remembered the strange tension that had followed her since the beginning of the evening. The orchestra faltered slightly before the musicians stopped playing altogether, unsure whether the interruption had been planned or not. Hundreds of guests turned in their seats to watch the woman who had arrived in a worn coat now walking slowly toward the front of the room where one of the most expensive weddings in Manhattan was supposed to continue without interruption. Each step she took across the marble floor carried a calm confidence that did not match the image people had formed about her earlier in the evening. Clara did not hurry and she did not hesitate. Her eyes remained fixed on the stage where the bride and groom stood frozen beneath the arch of white roses. Victoria's expression shifted from polite confusion to visible irritation as she watched the unexpected movement. This was her ceremony, her carefully planned moment, and the idea that someone might interrupt it felt almost unbelievable. She looked toward the wedding coordinator, expecting security to step forward immediately, yet no one moved. The hesitation spread through the room because Clara did not appear disruptive or chaotic. She simply walked forward as though she belonged there as much as anyone else. Ethan Caldwell remained seated at his table, his gaze following her calmly. He did not call out to stop her, and he did not attempt to explain her actions to the curious guests nearby. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, watching with the quiet patience of someone who knew that the moment unfolding had been inevitable from the beginning. At the altar, the groom's reaction was impossible to hide now. The color drained from his face as Clara moved closer. His hands tightened slightly at his sides while the officiant glanced between the bride and the approaching figure with clear uncertainty about how to continue the ceremony. Guests whispered softly to one another, wondering if this strange woman had somehow misunderstood the event or if she was about to cause an embarrassing scene in front of investors, executives, and social figures who had gathered to celebrate the marriage. But Clara's expression held none of the agitation people expected from someone interrupting a wedding. When she finally stopped a few steps from the stage, the room had fallen completely silent. She looked first at the groom. For a brief moment their eyes met and the recognition between them was unmistakable. It was the kind of recognition that carried history behind it, something deeper than a simple chance encounter. Then Clara turned her attention toward the guests, calmly observing the rows of curious faces staring back at her. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady and clear enough to reach every corner of the ballroom even without the microphone. She apologized politely for interrupting the ceremony, and explained that she had no intention of ruining a celebration that meant so much to the people present. The calm sincerity in her tone confused the guests even more. Victoria crossed her arms slightly, her patience beginning to fade as she asked if the woman could explain why she had decided this moment was appropriate for stepping into the aisle. Clara did not react to the sharpness in her voice. Instead she looked back toward the groom again, her eyes holding the same quiet certainty that had been there all evening. Then she said something that caused the tension in the room to tighten instantly. She explained that she had come because before this marriage continued there was something important the guests deserved to understand about the man standing at the altar. The words hung in the air like a sudden shift in the weather. Across the ballroom Ethan Caldwell watched calmly as the groom's composure began to fracture for the first time that night. Because the one person he had hoped would remain forgotten had just announced that the truth he had buried for years was about to be heard by everyone in the room. The silence that followed Clara's words felt heavier than the music that had filled the ballroom moments earlier. Hundreds of guests remained frozen in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or the beginning of something far more serious. The officiant lowered his notes slowly, glancing toward Victoria and the groom with quiet uncertainty. Victoria's expression hardened as she stepped slightly forward, her elegant white gown brushing softly against the floor. She asked Clara calmly but firmly what she meant by suggesting that the guests deserved to know something about the man she was about to marry. The question echoed across the quiet room. Clara did not rush to answer. Instead she turned slightly, allowing her gaze to pass across the faces of the people seated in the ballroom. Investors, executives, professors, journalists, and social figures were watching her now with intense curiosity. A few of them had already taken out their phones, sensing that whatever was happening might soon become the most talked about moment of the evening. Clara finally looked back at the groom. His composure had begun to fracture in small but visible ways. The confident smile he had practiced for the ceremony had vanished, replaced by the guarded expression of someone who suddenly realized that a secret he believed was safely buried had just walked into the room. Clara spoke again, her voice calm and steady. She explained that years ago she had worked in financial analysis and economic forecasting, publishing research that had been read by many of the people sitting in the ballroom that evening. The professor near Ethan leaned forward immediately when he heard those words, his eyes widening as the final pieces of recognition fell into place. Around him a few other guests began whispering quietly, sensing that the strange woman they had dismissed earlier might not be who they assumed. Clara continued speaking without raising her voice. She said that during that time she had trusted someone with access to her research and investment strategies. That person had taken her work, presented it as his own, and built a successful career using ideas that did not belong to him. The room grew even quieter. Some guests turned slowly toward the groom as the implication of her words began to settle. Victoria looked from Clara to the man standing beside her, confusion replacing the irritation she had shown earlier. The groom tried to respond with a dismissive laugh, insisting that the accusations made no sense, but the effort sounded forced. Clara watched him carefully, then reached into the pocket of her worn coat. The movement alone was enough to capture the full attention of the room. Instead of producing anything dramatic, she simply removed a small envelope that had clearly been carried for a long time. She held it up gently so the guests could see. Inside, she explained, were copies of research papers, dated emails, and financial proposals that had been written years before the groom's company suddenly rose to success. Documents that showed the original author of ideas that had later been presented to investors as his own. Murmurs spread quickly through the ballroom now. Several people recognized the type of evidence she described. The professor stood slowly from his chair. His voice filled with astonishment as he finally spoke the name that had been hidden in his memory all evening. He said that if what she was saying was true, then the woman standing in the aisle was not a stranger at all. She was Dr. Clara Bennett, the financial analyst whose predictions had once shaped major investment strategies across the country, before she disappeared from public view. The effect of hearing that name ripple through the room was immediate. Conversations erupted in whispers as more guests realized they had read her work years earlier. Clara remained calm as the recognition spread. She did not look proud or angry. She simply looked back at the groom, who now understood that the story he had rewritten for his own success had just been returned to the person who created it. For several seconds after the professor spoke Clara's name, the ballroom remained suspended in stunned silence, as if the entire celebration had paused to reconsider everything it believed about the quiet woman who had walked through the doors earlier that evening in a worn coat. The whispers spreading through the room were no longer mocking or confused. Now they carried recognition. Several guests began murmuring about articles they had once read in financial journals, about bold predictions that had accurately described shifts in international markets years before they happened. One investor near the back of the room leaned toward his colleague and quietly confirmed that Dr. Clara Bennett had once been considered one of the most promising analysts in the country before she had suddenly vanished from the industry without explanation. At the altar, the groom attempted to recover his composure, though the effort was clearly failing. He insisted that Clara was exaggerating old professional disagreements, claiming that success always attracted people looking to rewrite history. His voice sounded louder than necessary, as if volume alone might restore control of the situation. But the calm certainty on Clara's face made his defense appear increasingly fragile. She did not argue with him and she did not raise her voice. Instead, she opened the envelope she had been holding and handed several of the documents to the professor who had recognized her. The older man examined the pages carefully, adjusting his glasses as he read the dates and signatures. After a moment he slowly nodded, confirming quietly that the research was authentic, and had clearly existed long before the groom's company had presented similar ideas to investors. The effect of that confirmation spread instantly through the room. Guests who had arrived expecting champagne and celebration now exchanged serious looks with one another. Victoria stood beside the groom in stunned disbelief, the elegant confidence she had carried throughout the evening slowly dissolving as she realized that the person she had been defending moments earlier was struggling to explain a story that no longer held together. Clara watched the reactions calmly, her expression free from anger or triumph. When she spoke again, her voice remained steady and respectful. She explained that she had not come to destroy anyone's celebration, and that she had no interest in public humiliation. What she wanted was simple. For years her work had been taken, her reputation had disappeared, and the world had continued forward without knowing the truth. Tonight she had finally decided that silence was no longer necessary. The ballroom remained quiet as her words settled over the guests. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell rose from his seat for the first time since Clara had stepped into the aisle. He walked forward slowly until he stood beside her, his presence calm and supportive without interrupting the moment she had created. The groom looked between them with clear frustration, realizing that the story he had carefully built was now being questioned by the very people whose respect had once secured his success. Victoria lowered her gaze, the realization of the situation settling heavily over her. Clara did not remain in the aisle much longer. After the documents had passed through several curious hands and the murmurs of recognition had fully spread through the ballroom, she simply turned away from the altar. The quiet confidence that had carried her through the evening remained unchanged. Ethan walked beside her as they moved back toward the tall ballroom doors. Guests parted slightly to allow them through, watching with the strange mixture of curiosity and respect reserved for moments that would soon become unforgettable stories. Just before reaching the exit, Ethan asked Clara softly what she planned to do next now that the truth had finally been spoken. Clara paused briefly, glancing once more at the room behind them where the celebration had transformed into something entirely different from what anyone expected. Then she gave a small, thoughtful smile and answered that sometimes the most powerful victory was not reclaiming the past, but simply reminding the world who had written it in the first place before stepping quietly out into the Manhattan night.